Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight and in the early morning. William, thank you. Every morning for the past week and a half, I've woken up hoping that we'd see an end to the outbreak of fighting in Israel and the civil unrest within its borders and the blatant acts of anti-Semitism online and by political leaders all around the world. And today came the news that Israel had reached a ceasefire agreement. I know that'll be a long road ahead for peace, as we all know, but certainly a ceasefire is a good start. Now we could start having a dialogue. So thank you for joining us tonight for this important briefing. We are honored to welcome William Daroff live from Israel. Thank you. Jewish federations and our partners have been on the ground bringing life-saving humanitarian aid, including emergency grants to victims and their families, psychological counseling to all those affected, and support for first responders throughout this entire crisis. Thank you to those who have donated directly to our Israel Emergency Fund. It is with much appreciation, so thank you. As Jewish Nevada and United Nevada Jewish Communities, we have been supportive of the government of Israel and the IDF as it has undertook its sacred work to protect and defend our beloved Jewish state. We mourn those innocent civilians who have died, both Israelis and Palestinians alike. We send our prayers for speedy recoveries for all those innocent people who have been injured. We were reminded as this crisis continued to escalate that the government of Israel and the IDF were making the necessary strategic and tactical decisions to keep Israel safe today and in the future. Israel didn't seek this conflict, but it aggressively sought the best outcome for the country's security. Israel has the right to defend itself as a sovereign nation and protect its citizens. So with that, we will return to Israel as a community soon on a birthright trip together with IAC later this summer, I think in August, and then together as a Nevada community on a statewide mission. This has been far too long because of the pandemic that we have all experienced over the last 2 years. We are excited to once again walk the streets, visit with our family and friends, pray in synagogues, eat in restaurants, and shop in stores. And we will celebrate, as always, that we have the privilege of living in a time when we, the Jewish people, can shape our own history and not to be the victims of a fate determined by others. Never again. Join me in keeping Israel in our thoughts, prayers, most importantly, in our hearts. Thank you for being here, Rabbi Tecktiel.
Thank you, Josh.
Thank you.
On behalf of the Board of Rabbis, I want to also welcome everyone. Some of us are here simply to learn more about what's happening on the ground in Israel. Some of us are here tonight to show solidarity for our family, friends, and fellow Jews in Israel, to pray for the Israeli victims of terror. Some of us are here because we have compassion for the loss of innocent lives in Gaza, even while we stand for Israel's right to defend herself and her right to exist and to defend herself from those who seek to destroy her. Some of us are here to learn about what the effect this is all having on the rest of Jews around the world. Some of us are here to learn about what we can do in the face of uncertainty and alienation. We come for some of these reasons, for all of these reasons, but we come because we care. We're devastated by the senseless loss of life and pray for the families of the Israelis and the Palestinians suffering even as we speak. Whatever brought you here tonight, our goal is to inform and to give perspective, information and perspective that we're not really getting from the American media. As Josh mentioned, we've given word today that there will be a ceasefire. So before we begin tonight, I wanted to take a few moments to offer a few words of prayer in the hopes that the ceasefire will hold and there will be some quiet and peace in the coming weeks. The prayer is taken from the words of the Siddur Lev Shalem, the Siddur that we use and we recite this prayer each Shabbat. Avinu Shabbat Shamayim, stronghold and redeemer of the people of Israel. Bless the state of Israel that it may be the beginning of our redemption. Shield it with your love, spread over it your shelter of peace. Guide its leaders and advisors with your light and your truth. Help them with your good counsel. Strengthen the hands of those who defend the Holy Land. Deliver them. Crown their efforts with triumph. Bless the land with peace and its inhabitants with lasting joy. And let us say, Amen. And now I want to turn it over to the CEO of the Jewish Nevada, Stefanie, who has like to introduce our speaker.
Thank you so much. William, once again, thank you so much for joining us this evening or very early morning for you. We are honored to have you here. I've had the pleasure and privilege of working with you alongside you throughout my time as a Jewish communal professional and through the Federation system. Your bio is extremely impressive, and it really is an honor to hear from you this evening on the current situation in Israel. William Daroff became the Chief Executive Officer of the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations on February 1st, 2020. In that capacity, he is the senior professional guiding the conference's agenda on behalf of the 53 national member organizations, which represent the wide mosaic of American Jewish life. Previously, he was the Senior Vice President for Public Policy and Director of the Washington office of the Jewish Federations of North America, where for 15 years he was the Chief Lobbyist and Principal Spokesperson on Public Policy and International Affairs for 146 Jewish federations and more than 300 independent communities. Named by the Jerusalem Post as being among the 50 most influential Jews worldwide, and by the Forward newspaper as among the 50 most influential Jews in America, Daroff guides the Jewish community's advocacy efforts on the Federation movement's key policy issues. He is a key player in foreign policy circles, advising policymakers and elected officials on Jewish communal concerns, namely those related to the U.S.-Israel relationship, the Middle East conflict, and efforts to prevent Iran from developing a nuclear weapon. He is also a leader in the worldwide fight to combat the assault on Israel's legitimacy, having created the Federation Movement's Israel Action Network, and having served on both the steering committee of the Prime Minister of Israel's Global Task Force and the Conference of Presidents Working Group. In addition to his focus on foreign relations, Daroff is also a leader on domestic policy issues, principally on health and human services, such as Medicare and Medicaid, long-term care, and policies affecting older Americans, including Holocaust survivors, as well as homeland security programs and strengthening the capacity of charities to care for those in need. And I know this, Daroff is also a social networking pioneer and evangelist, because in April 2016, the JTA News named him the most influential person on Jewish Twitter. Prime Minister Netanyahu followed second. Daroff received his bachelor's degree in political science and history, master's degree in political science, and a Juris Doctorate from Case Western Reserve University in his hometown of Cleveland. He is an adjunct professor at George Washington University. And personally, he lives in suburban Washington, D.C. with his wife, Heidi, and their 2 children. It says that you met in Krakow, Poland while studying, and I like looked up how to pronounce it, but I'm going to say it wrong still. What's the name of the university?
Jagiellonian University, with my fellow alum, Copernicus, class of 1364.
Wow. Well, from which you both received certificates in the history of Eastern European Jewry and the Holocaust. It's a lot. We are certainly grateful to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And just for the record, Copernicus did not receive a certificate in the history of Eastern European Jewry and the Holocaust, but my wife and I did. Good morning from Israel. It is wonderful to be with you. It is 4:15 in the morning here, and I'm, despite the picture behind me, which shows a daytime Tel Aviv, it is very much nighttime, and I am on the balcony of our Airbnb in Tel Aviv, and pleased to be with you. I appreciate that kind introduction, Stefanie, and thank you to Jewish Nevada, ADL, the IAC, and the Board of Rabbis for inviting me. I'm honored to be the guest speaker this evening and to provide some thoughts on the crisis here in Israel, that has hopefully just ended, as Josh mentioned and Brad mentioned, with the ceasefire that started 3 hours ago. As I look around thus far is holding, how this crisis unfolded and what the fallout has been globally from my perspective as the CEO of the Conference of Presidents. As Jennifer noted, the conference is the umbrella organization of 53 national Jewish organizations from across the religious, political, and ideological spectrums, and the central coordinating body of the American Jewish community since our founding in 1956. As the indispensable Jewish organization, uniquely positioned to represent literally every facet of our community, we play an essential role in endeavoring to present a united front on issues of concern to the Jewish people. We are a principal voice of the American Jewish community as it relates to our government in Washington, as well as to other governments and institutions here in Israel, Europe, and around the world. I'd like to begin by noting briefly how amazing it is to have had the opportunity to be here in Israel, to embrace Israelis on behalf of American Jewry during this time of crisis when they are most in need. As I said to the President of Israel, Reuven Rivlin, this afternoon, the resilience of the people here in Israel is striking to see. Here in Tel Aviv, it's encouraging to witness Israelis go about their lives without fear. You would never know that many have been running in and out of bomb shelters for more than a week. This remarkable resilience is made possible by the protection, day and night, of the brave men and women of the Israel Defense Forces, who defend the civilian population of Israel, Jews and Arabs alike, by standing guard around the clock. It brings me great pride to say that one of my daughters, Lily, enlisted in the IDF almost 2 years ago and is currently serving in the spokesperson's unit. We have been very much in the role of IDF parents since we've been here for the last 4 or 5 days, where she, as we speak, she is on her base, where she, for the last 12 nights, has been working 12-hour night shifts. And we've been really blessed to have the opportunity to feed her breakfast, watch her sleep, feed her dinner, and send her off to base every day this week. It is really a great honor to be her parent and to be here amongst all of Israel during this crisis. So moving on to tonight's topic, how did we get here? The origins of this crisis can be traced back, in my view, to the decision by Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas to postpone indefinitely the parliamentary elections that were to be held this month and to pin the blame on Israel. It is widely recognized that his lack of popular support and internal political divisions led to this desperate move that leaned on the familiar rhetoric of hate and incitement, and in turn led to violence against Israelis. This action by Abbas, who is in the 16th year of his 4-year term, was clearly motivated by his fear of losing power to Hamas were an election to be held. Rather than face the voters, he decided to deny democracy to the Palestinian people while trying to use Israel as a pretext for his decision. Abbas's choice to put his personal interests ahead of the well-being of the Palestinian people kicked off a new round of political jockeying with Hamas, where the Palestinian Authority and Hamas attempted to outdo each other through incitement against Israel in order to win popular Palestinian support on the street. As Palestinian leadership fanned the flames of violence and hate, riots and lawlessness broke out in Jerusalem, amplified by dual accusation of Israeli abuses regarding evictions in Sheikh Jarrah, neighborhood of Jerusalem, and access to the Al-Aqsa Mosque during the month of Ramadan. The eviction issue is a very complicated legal dispute between private parties that is decades old, that was seized upon and turned into a nationalist struggle against Israel by Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. As far as the alleged restrictions to entering the Temple Mount, the 17,000 Muslims who celebrated the end of Ramadan there just a few days ago seems to disprove that claim. Regardless, both of these issues became mob rallying cries, and the Palestinian incitement spun out of control as Hamas upped the ante by firing rockets into Israel. We are well aware of what has transpired since that opening salvo. The world watched in horror as the violence continued to escalate in a sustained assault against Israel from Gaza. Hamas picked a fight with Israel on false pretenses. Israel defended itself with necessary force, and somehow it is Israel that has been condemned and villainized as the aggressor, even though no other country in the history of our world would be content to let an endless, unprovoked siege on its population go unanswered. In the ensuing 11-day conflict, on one side was a sovereign democratic state acting to defend the safety and security of its citizens in constant danger. On the other was a U.S. designated terrorist organization that knowingly jeopardizes the lives of the people it claimed to be fighting for while indiscriminately attacking Israeli civilians. The men and women of the IDF took unprecedented efforts to avoid civilian casualties amongst the Palestinians. Hamas fired more than 4,000 rockets into Israel, hoping to murder as many innocent people as possible. Hundreds of these Hamas rockets fell short and landed in Gaza, recklessly endangering the lives and taking the lives of countless Palestinians. Even more despicably, Hamas places its operations among Palestinian civilians in order to use them as human shields. This shameful strategy constitutes a double war crime, indiscriminately firing at Israeli civilians while hiding behind the Palestinian population. Despite extraordinary precautions, including prior civilian warnings when the IDF makes a surgical strike targeting terrorists and their firing positions, civilian casualties cannot always be avoided. While Hamas launches rockets into Israel with murderous intent, the Iron Dome missile defense system has a 90% interception rate, providing a protective umbrella for the people of Israel, Jews and Arabs alike, and minimizing civilian casualties. Incredibly, there are those that criticize this life-saving technology, claiming that it's not a fair fight with Hamas since Israel has the Iron Dome. The critics are right in the sense that it's not a fair fight. In the court of public opinion, Israel is at a significant disadvantage against Hamas. For far too many, Israel can do no right and Hamas can do no wrong. Facts and truth, it seems, have become a casualty of war. Too much of the world creates a false equivalence between Hamas terror attacks deliberately aimed at murdering Israeli civilians and Israeli actions as a responsible state defending its population. Any objective observer should see what took place as a battle between good and evil and should know which side is which. Sadly, many fail to draw this clear and unequivocal distinction between the two sides. Perhaps this is due in part to social media becoming a major flashpoint during the conflict, with celebrity influencers condemning Israel in a way that we haven't previously seen. Incitement against Israel spread far beyond the Middle East, morphing into outright anti-Semitism in the United States. Innocent Jewish patrons just a couple days ago, depending on your calendar, at a restaurant in Los Angeles were targeted in an anti-Semitic attack perpetrated by vicious anti-Israel mobs that it's the stated intention of attacking Jews. We've seen similar actions in the last few days in South Florida, in New York, in Chicago, and across the United States. These disgusting, reprehensible assaults are an unconscionable affront to basic American values. Under the broadly accepted definition of anti-Semitism developed by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the IHRA or IRA, which has been adopted by the United States and more than 30 other countries across the globe, quote, holding Jews collectively responsible for the actions of the state of Israel, unquote, constitutes anti-Semitism. The commission of anti-Semitic hate crimes so plainly motivated by the animosity towards Israel underscores the need for the universal adoption of the IRA definition. This conflation of anti-Israel sentiment with anti-Semitism should be a wake-up call to those who bury their heads in the sand and refuse to say that criticism of Israel can ever cross a line and become anti-Semitism. Moreover, these modern-day pogroms demonstrate the far-reaching consequences of incitement and political opportunism by Palestinian leadership. To conclude, there can be no justification for the ruthless terrorist attacks that killed innocent Israelis, including children. Israel has the legitimate right to defend her citizens against such violence. May we grieve for the Israeli lives lost to these attacks and wish for speedy recovery for those injured. And in fact, may we grieve for all the lives that have been lost to these attacks, Jews and Arabs alike, Palestinians and Israelis alike. Thank you again, Stefanie, Josh, Brad, and to everyone at Jewish Nevada, the ADL and the IAC, and the Board of Rabbis for the opportunity to share my views this evening. I look forward to engaging with you all in the further discussion to follow. And again, it is a great, great honor to be here in Israel on behalf of American Jewry, to express our solidarity and our connectivity with the Israeli people during this time of need, as well as to be with you in Nevada from afar, from many time zones away, to join with you in solidarity on behalf of our people here and there. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion, the question and answers that follow. We turn to Josh or Brad?
No, there you go.
Sorry, I was muted. I'm sorry. Thank you, William. I appreciate your insights and to letting us know what's going on the ground there. I'm going to ask those of you who have any questions, you can type into the Q&A, and we'll see if we can get to some of those questions. I want to start with a question. I don't even know if you are aware of this yet, because it might have happened while you were sleeping. But Senator Sanders announced today that he's presenting a resolution to call into question the $735 million in security funds that are coming up due to Israel to help with security. I was just wondering what you thought about the current situation here in the United States with some of the more progressive senators and representatives that are calling into question some of the funds that normally get very bipartisan support in the Congress. So maybe you can start with that, and then we'll see what other questions people have.
Great, thank you. I will note that I don't know that I would say that when I was sleeping, I'd say that when I was briefly napping for a few hours. I did see that news this morning, our time here in Israel. I find it really outrageous that as our close partner, Israel endures the ruthless assault of over 4,000 rockets flying towards us here, which stretched into 11 days, that blocking the arms sale would embolden the enemies of Israel and threaten the safety and security of our top ally here in the Middle East. The state of Israel needs the ironclad support of the United States now more than ever. And I encourage folks to stand up for the United States-Israel relationship by standing in forceful opposition to any and all attempts to stop this arms sale or any arms sale, which would send the wrong message at the worst possible time. I salute President Biden and the Biden administration in general. As it relates to this specific issue, President Biden has said that the arms sale will continue and will go forward. And as a sort of quick codicil, these are for precision arms that would actually flow next year. So it's not arms that would be used in the current conflict, but God forbid in the next conflict. And while I'm at it, let me just salute President Biden for giving a hechsher, a kosher certification to Israel for the actions of these last 2 weeks, of saying and declaring clearly for the world community, for America, and a number of times at the United Nations, that Israel is in the right here, and that Israel, like all nations, has a right to defend herself. The Biden administration went beyond the call of duty at the United Nations and stopped 4 different anti-Israel statements from moving forward, as well as a French resolution that was adopted as well. President Biden, Secretary Blinken, and the Biden administration have been precisely where we in the pro-Israel community would like for them to have been, to ensure, as I said, that all of Israel and her foes know that America has her back.
I have just a quick question, if you don't mind.
Sure.
But this is really for our participants. But we have something that we're dealing with here in Nevada, and the Nevada Democratic chair of our party here, Judith Whitmer, released a statement. I just want to read you just 2 lines from the statement, and your reaction is going to be tough, like ours was. And everyone on this call would like to know what do we do with it? Okay, how do we answer our call to address this? Okay, so this is from Judith Whitmer, that was released, I believe, 4 days ago now. Is that correct, Steph? I think that's correct. So it says, the world, and I quote, "The world cannot stand by as we witness atrocities and human rights violations being committed against Palestinians. People are being forced from their homes and tear gassed while praying. People, including children, are being killed. Palestinians have the right to live in peace. No caveats."
I guess I'd first say that I liked Harry Reid's Nevada Democratic Party a little bit better. I find, I'm not sure if that's the entire statement. I find it
I'll send it to you.
Equally outrageous that the events in Jerusalem would be taken totally out of context and without recognition of the Israeli fulfillment of trying to create civil order and Israeli responsibility for peace on the Temple Mount, as well as obviously the sort of disproportionate nature of the statement, not recognizing the indiscriminate firing rockets, over 4,000 rockets at civilians throughout the state of Israel. I think it's clearly tone deaf. I think she's clearly out of touch with the reality of what's happening here, and frankly, I think does a disservice to Democrats throughout the state of Nevada, and is totally out of sync with the Biden administration, with the leader of the Democratic Party in the United States. So I'd say that is a fringe statement that is not representative of reality here on the ground, or frankly, where the majority of Democrats across the United States stand, including the leader of the Democratic Party.
So another quick question that I think that somebody here asked, and I think it's a question that we're all thinking about also. Oftentimes in these conflicts, there are things that sort of come as a surprise to us. I remember back with in 2014, Tzuk Eitan, the terror tunnels that we didn't really know about came out. In this conflict, the surprise really has been not so much what is happening in Gaza, but what's happening in some of the major cities like Lod and Akko and Ramla, where there have been Israeli Arabs attacking Jews, Jewish Israelis, and Jewish Israelis attacking Israeli Arabs in towns where people were getting along fairly well up until now. And now there's sort of this mob mentality on the streets. I wonder if you can speak to that and what's going on in Israel now and how they're addressing that.
Yeah, I would agree, Brad, that has been a shocking turn of events. A number of thoughts about it. One is that it's clearly linked to the incitement by Palestinian leadership. As leaders, it is incumbent upon us to bring about calm, to try to ensure that our people are safe, to try to ensure that we are in a place where we can conduct ourselves and our lives in a regular fashion. Instead, what we've seen from Palestinian leadership has been the exact opposite, which has been focusing on incitement and hate, as I said, in part to distract from other issues and competition in the Palestinian leadership. We've seen that bleed into Israeli Arab communities with shocking stories of, as you mentioned, of Israeli Arabs attacking Jews and Jews responding in kind. It speaks to larger foundational and fundamental issues in Israeli civil society that need to be addressed, issues of equality and equal opportunity and how municipal resources are distributed and the like. It also speaks, frankly, to a disconnect with the Israeli police here, without being too critical of the Israeli police, where unfortunately they've seen Arab-on-Arab crime as being something for the Arab community to deal with, and as a consequence have allowed for great stockpiling of weapons by Israeli Arabs, which now that they've turned them on the Jewish community, the police are all of a sudden interested. And I think that, again, speaks to a disconnect in sort of the foundational fundamentals of civil society here in Israel. I'm told by those who deal with issues of people-to-people exchanges and connectivity and building Israeli Arab civil society, that this is not a problem that's going to go away overnight, but it's also one that by opening the eyes of Israel to the legitimate issues between these communities, that these are issues that can be dealt with, that can be worked through, and that working together, once we're outside of the heat of the current kinetic conflict, the conflict that ended, God willing, 2.5 hours ago, that Israeli civil society will be able to move forward from that. But it clearly is something that we all need to watch, and I think it's clearly something that we need to engage with, to recognize that all Israelis, Jews, Arabs, Christians, are full-fledged citizens of the state of Israel and need to be respected as such.
Thank you. Question was asked about. We often hear in the news and in the media that Israel is referred to as an apartheid state. What is it that we can do? Where can we find information to combat that notion? Especially looking at what's going on now, people are really pushing that narrative. What is it that we can do to help combat that?
Yeah, I think this is yet another canard. It's interesting. The polling data shows that the vast majority of Americans have no idea what apartheid was, which I think is great. It shows that the concept of South African apartheid is thankfully in the dustbin of history. But if you look at the fundamentals of what apartheid was, and you look at what the state of Israel is, you will see that there really is no connection between it. There are Arabs who serve on the Supreme Court of Israel. There are Arabs who served and serve in senior positions in government, in ministries of the state of Israel, who have senior positions in the IDF that are engaged in defending the state of Israel. There are legal protections and legal equality that exist for all Israelis, and it's really it's a talking point by anti-Israel forces who know that there is this sort of dim recollection of the word apartheid and what it was and what it means, and try to conflate what was a systematic, century-long diminution of non-whites in South Africa to Israel, and there really is not it's not a fair comparison, and it's one that you'll see South African apartheid opponents speaking out against, because they believe that it minimizes the danger and the hate and the history of what apartheid was by bringing it into modern context where there really is no connection between it. As far as resources, the organizations that are sponsoring this talk, the Federation, ADL, IAC, the Board of Rabbis, I hope, have resources that are available, things that you can look at on the websites. I know of Jewish Nevada, I know of ADL and IAC, where there are resources that will talk about the true Israel, that talk about how Israel, like America, is not a perfect country, as we've seen over the last couple years of demonstrations in the United States and the whole sort of reckoning with our history. Here in Israel, it's also a work in progress, a quite a 75-year work in process, as distinct from Israel's 200 and it's too early in the morning for me to do the math, 240 some years history of the United States. For sure, there is a need for reform and progress in America, as there is in Israel. But the comparison, I think, is outrageous, and one that seeks to inflame rather than to bring people together.
Another question that I think people have been asking is, and again, it goes back to the things that are sometimes surprising that come out of these things. And one of the things that people were surprised about, I think, was the number of rockets that that Hamas was able to obtain and stockpile over the last couple of years. Number one, where do you think they're getting these rockets? And do you think that Iran is playing a role? And where the current administration is talking about re-entering to the Iran deal. And do you think that that's going to play a role in what's going on in that area of the world right now?
An excellent question, Brad. And for sure, the mullahs in Iran are very much at the control switch here. They are the primary funders of Hamas. The rockets, there are a number of different sets of rockets that have been launched at Israel. The more sophisticated ones, the ones that have a longer range, like those that could come here to Tel Aviv or deeper into the south. There was a launch towards Dimona and even one towards Eilat, which is 200 kilometers away from Gaza, are ones that are in fact Iranian rockets with Iranian technology. Most of the thousands of rockets that were launched on the south are ones that are homemade rockets, homemade by Hamas in rocket factories in Gaza. These are ones that have been estimated to cost no more than $50 or $60 to put together, made from street signs, made from leftover construction equipment, and the like. But the funding for all of it comes from Iran, and absolutely, as it relates to conversations about re-entering or forming a new Iran deal, a deal with the Iranians. Iran's malevolent activities throughout the region and the world must be taken into account. I think whether it is attacks in Israel, whether it is attacks against Saudi Arabia, whether it is supporting terrorists in Europe or South America or across the world, whether it is a proliferation of ballistic missile technology, and obviously their continuing efforts to seek a nuclear capacity. These issues need to be front and center in how the world relates to and connects to and thinks about Iran.
You had mentioned in your talk that you put a lot of the blame on the beginning of this conflict on Abbas and his decision to cancel the elections and sort of create this situation for his political gain. Do you see that coming from the other side at all, from the Israeli side? Do we see Netanyahu using this as an opportunity for himself and his political gain?
You know, certainly the timing is fascinating. As we speak here, President Rivlin, who, as I mentioned, I was with a few hours ago, had given a mandate to Prime Minister Netanyahu to form a government. He was not able to form that government. The mandate switched to Yair Lapid, the leader of the opposition, who is in the process with that clock ticking. I believe, again, a little bit too early for me to do the math, I think there are 10 or 11 days left in that mandate for Lapid to form a government, after which, if he's not able to form it, he can ask President Rivlin for an extension, which President Rivlin can give or not, after which the president can either call elections if a government hasn't been formed, or he can throw it to the Knesset, the technical term being for a jump ball, where any member of the Knesset who can get 61 signatures can become the next prime minister. And if they're not able to get that, then they would go to a fifth set of elections. My sense is that, to talk about the politics for a second, my sense is that if in fact the ceasefire holds, that Israel, in its resilience, will revert back to the political scene as it was before this conflict began. And so I think it's anybody's guess as to who the next prime minister will be, and whether Bibi will continue to hold out, or whether there'll be fifth elections, or whether Lapid will be able to form a government. I will categorically state, in response to sort of the inference of that question that came from one of the viewers, that there is no indication that politics played a role in the conduct of this current, in the immediate conduct of this conflict. Israeli support and Israeli political leadership has had wall-to-wall support for the governmental action, for responding to the rocket fire. And frankly, sort of the inference of the question, I think, blames the victims. The people who started this conflict are the ones who were launching those rockets, were funding those rockets, and were indiscriminately attacking Israeli civilians. So I don't see the politics as having a role in the conduct of this conflict.
Do you get a sense that that Israel and the military feel like they have achieved whatever goals they were hoping to achieve in Gaza during these 10 days of bombardment and action?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Brad. For those of us who've been watching the scene for a while, it seems a little bit like Groundhog Day. There was 7 years ago, a similar operation that resulted in, mostly 7 years of a cold peace, one that was seen with sporadic attacks on Gaza border communities like Sderot. I think there is definitely a feeling that this sort of pressing repeat and hoping to go another 7 years without a major conflict is one that is not a way to run a railroad. However, given the political situation among the Palestinians and Hamas's quote unquote leadership or rule of Gaza, I don't know that there is really another choice. To have a ground invasion of Gaza, which is what it would take to really completely dismantle the terrorist infrastructure, is something that the world community wouldn't stand for, something that would cost, God forbid, many Israeli lives, as well as many more Palestinian lives, generally innocent Palestinian lives, Palestinians who are being held hostage by and as human shields by the terrorist thugs of Hamas. So I think it is, to your question about feeling satisfied, I think that there will be satisfaction when Israelis are not in a place where 4,000 rockets will be launched in them over an 11-day period. But I think it's not one where there's either going to be many celebrations here in Tel Aviv or throughout Israel at the ceasefire, but rather relief that this chapter, God willing, is closing, and that Israel will move forward. So it's again, it's not a thrilling and exciting sort of VE Day, folks dancing in the streets. However, the sort of immediate cessation of the kinetic piece of this conflict is something that all Israelis are pleased about, and I'm sure the Palestinians are pleased about as well, because again, this fight that is being held through incitement, through proxies, is one that serves no one in this neighborhood well.
Someone also asked, there were a few rockets that were fired, they think, by members of Hamas from Lebanon as a mortar or two that were shot from Syria. Do you see, is there any discussion about Lebanon or Syria entering the fray or concern about that?
Yeah, another excellent question. So from Syria and Lebanon, there were, I'd say, less than a dozen rocket attacks. From Lebanon, they were actually not by Hamas, but by sort of disgruntled Palestinian splinter groups. Both Hezbollah and the Lebanese government immediately disclaimed those attacks, sending up a clear signal to the Israelis that they were not looking for further engagement. From Syria as well, it was an ISSS sect, a sort of break-off that launched some rocket attacks. Those rocket attacks from Syria, in fact, didn't make it across the border into the Golan. But again, I think folks in the neighborhood were not interested in expanding this conflict right now. That being said, as we're talking about the issue of, in your previous question about how it is that Hamas was able to stockpile these weapons, in southern Lebanon, it is estimated there are over 100,000 rockets and missiles that are there that can be launched at sites in northern Israel at a moment's notice. And this is another dividend of Iran's relationship with Hezbollah and Iran's malevolent activities throughout the region. And it is something that absolutely there needs to be a focus on to ensure that Israel is safe. Thankfully, Hezbollah has been focused on Syria, on being a proxy for Iran in Syria, and has not been focusing on Israel. But tensions in the north are something that we absolutely need to keep an eye on.
So again, I want to thank you. I want to ask one final question, because I think many people are thinking about this as well, is what can we do now, right? What are there concrete things that we can do? Someone even asked, does Israel need volunteers? Should we have people who are interested in going to help Israel right now? Can you think of a couple concrete?
I'm sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. Can you hear me?
There we go. Sorry, I lost my audio for a second. I'm sorry, what was the question, Brad?
So as a final question, I was just going to ask, are there concrete things that you can think of that we can be doing right now, other than writing our congressmen and pushing them to support Israel and those funding? Is there other things that we should be doing right now? Someone even asked, does Israel need volunteers? Should people, I don't even know if the airport's open right now for us to be able to travel there, plus COVID. So, but are there concrete things that you can think of that we could be doing as a community here in Las Vegas?
For sure, I would actually start with the first thing you said, which is, other than our members of Congress, your members of Congress absolutely need to hear from you, Republicans and Democrats alike. They need to hear that the U.S.-Israel relationship is something that is of paramount importance to our community and to their constituents. The statement you read from the state party chair speaks to the absolute essential need for members of Congress and senators to hear where we stand as a people. And that's something that cannot be said often enough or loudly enough. I think that expressing solidarity with Israelis and with Israel is something that we in the American Jewish community need to do and speak out loudly about. Unfortunately, there are many voices of discontent in America who are looking to destabilize the U.S.-Israel relationship, who are looking at opportunities to hit Israel over the head. And I think it's important for Israel and Israelis and for the world community to know that we in America stand with Israel, full stop, period. The sort of lack of focus, the lack of concrete support for Israel in many circles is one that is thankfully a minority view within America. It must stay a minority view among Americans. And the way for that to occur is for us to go forth and talk to our neighbors, talk to our neighbors, Jewish and non-Jewish alike, to talk to them about the reality of life here in Israel, the reality of what Israelis have done to create out of sand an amazing startup nation that is leading the world and providing so much insight to all of the world and so much innovation. That is important for them to hear from us, as well as I mentioned Congress. I think the White House needs to hear from us as well to have our thanks that America continues to have the back of Israel, and that we demand that America continue to have the back of Israel. As far as getting here to Israel, it's very difficult at present because of COVID and because of the conflict here. We had 3 flights that were canceled by United Airlines, but El Al continues to fly here to Israel, and they flew throughout the conflict. My sense is that those flights will continue once there is by United and Delta and American and other U.S. carriers that fly to Israel, that will restart as soon as there is a sustained peace. And my sense is that probably in the next month or so, there will be an opening for all Americans to come to Israel without having the restrictions that currently are in place. Since the IAC is one of the hosts here, I will advise you that Israelis, people with Israeli passports, are very much able to come to Israel today. Those of us who have first-degree relatives here in Israel are able, through a typically bureaucratic Israeli process, to apply through the consulate. I would assume Los Angeles is your consulate that's the closest to Las Vegas. To apply through the consulate in LA, you can find details on their website about how to do so. It's complicated, but doable. And then with COVID tests upon departure and upon arrival, and for those of us vaccinated, a serology test upon arrival, you can get out of quarantine relatively quickly. And so I would say yes, as soon as you are able, based on your passport and citizenship status, to come to Israel, you should come. I encourage you to come, show solidarity. It is, from a COVID perspective, it's amazing to be here. It's as though COVID never happened. There are some masks around, but it's very much limited, and they do believe that they've reached herd immunity here across the board. And so, absolutely, I think the number one way we can all join together and celebrate Israel, to give a collective hug to our Israeli brothers and sisters, is to come here to Israel and show solidarity, and to do that as soon as you are able. And so I encourage all the organizations to come in a solidarity mission. I know that the federations nationally are looking at it. I know that ADL is looking at it. I know for sure IAC is looking at it. And so as soon as it is practicable, jump on a plane and come here. You're in and around Las Vegas, which means you have a great airport where you can leave at all hours of the night. And play the slots on your way out. So I encourage you to come here to vote with your feet and be a part of Startup Nation, and really to show the world and to show Israel that we stand in solidarity with Israel during tough times and during great times. And so thank you for that opportunity, Brad, to plug this. And I hope the Israeli Ministry of Tourism is listening.
So I've been asked, thank you so much, by the way. I've been getting texts from a bunch of friends who are on the call, and maybe now is not the time to do this. Maybe if you would be so kind as to give us your time one more time. Is a lot of people are asking, what is the solution? What is the solution to this ongoing conflict? And we only have 5 minutes, so I don't know if you could throw it all in 5 minutes, but if you'd be willing to come back, I know a lot of people would love to hear your input on what is the solution.
Yeah, let me just, tough to do that in 6 minutes. I will say that one piece of it, which we're seeing from the Biden administration, is to follow up on the previous administration's efforts to broaden the relationships that Israel has in the region here. The Abrahamic Accords with UAE, with Bahrain, with Sudan, with Morocco, and moving towards other states in the region really show the place that Israel has here and are an opening to what a future could look like. You'd mentioned, Brad had mentioned the JCPOA and the deal with Iran, and frankly, it is that first Iran deal, the first JCPOA, that brought together Israel and the Gulf states against their common foe of Iran. And we see, notwithstanding the difficulties of the last 10 or 11 days, that those relationships continue to be strong on a business-to-business relationship, on a political-to-political relationship, and a cultural-to-cultural relationship. And I think it's important that it be clear that the road to peace in the region does not necessarily have to go through Ramallah. That if we are to count on President Abbas, who, as I said, is working through the end of his 16th year of his 4-year term, if he is the key to reaching peace, then peace will not be achieved. And so by broadening the relationships that Israel has throughout the region to folks who are not in the same sort of political cul-de-sac as the Palestinian leadership here, I believe that that is a clear answer to the future, and one that I'm impressed and pleased that the Biden administration intends to continue. If you look at the talk from the Gulf states and from the region, it's much more muted than it has been in the past, and I think that that is, and behind the scenes, a much different level of communication. And so I think that that is, if you squint just enough, you can see the light at the end of the tunnel and see that this is another path out, rather than the path that's really just been a circular path, a one-way cul-de-sac without a clear exit to moving out of this conflict.
Well, thank you again, William, and I want to thank Jewish Nevada for helping us put us all together, and the other organizations, and thank you all who joined us this evening. It is our hope and our prayer that that there will be peace in the area, in the land of Israel, and thank you all for joining us. Have a great night, everyone.
Amen to that, and again, thank you all, and good morning from Tel Aviv.
Thank
So
you.
much, William. Thank you.